then the thing will find its real fruition in being able to communicate and being a good system. What is sort of frustrating is that when we got the first PDP-1 back in the late 50s and early 60s, we made systems for it, and some of them were good, and some of them, were developmental and so on. But you may look at a modern personal computer that you go to the store and buy today. And in some ways, of course, it's better, but in many ways, a lot of the ideas that were in those machines, now, over 20 years ago, still haven't been realized in the personal computer. And I think the most important one has to do with really getting the operating system to be much more general and
helpful.
And helpful,
Yeah. And helpful.
In some ways, I have to say that the personal computers, which took a different tack, like having a BASIC online, where the editor and the BASIC and everything all worked in a very nice way. That was a kind of innovation which was pretty good, and sort of came from the Dartmouth approach.
Yeah.
A lot of the ideas you see in personal computers came from timesharing, because timesharing was where you first gave people access on a terminal to computation.
To give you some example, my own experience of that is that when I use my own personal computer, which is really personal at home, I get frustrated by the fact that you cannot mix tasks. There is just no communication between the different groups. It gets to the point that, for instance, there are some programs that there is no way that you can get out of it and get into something else without turning off the computer totally.
Oh, well, that's extreme.
Yeah, that is another thing, or the reason.
Yeah, that's extreme, though.
Yeah, but
just as an example, when CTSS, the first time-sharing system here, came into operation, you could write a program, and you could write a piece of it in Fortran, and you could write a piece of it in something else, I think MAD, or in a machine language in what was SAP or FAP or something, FAP.
Yeah.
And these pieces could all be put together and run together and so on. And that was good. There was nothing wrong with it. It was simply 100% good. Now, if you look at a computer today, it may have a basic system. It may have a Pascal. It might have Forth or God knows what. These are all come from little vendors, and they're totally different. They're incompatible. What one writes on a disk, the next one can't read. And and so it's sort of strange. We can understand how it's happened that way, but it's crystal clear that it could be a lot better. And a lot of the direction they ought to go is to look at some of the early times.
There are some problems to be solved, however, that are tricky. Because, for instance, the reason why I have to turn off my computer to get into something else after using Visical is the reason that unless I'm forced to do that, somebody could copy Visicals from the memory. And that's a very rudimentary way.
All the computer stores now sell. What's the name of that little card you buy? That
a wild card.
Is it a wild card or something that says this card will let you? They're very clever about the wording. They don't say let you copy all these disks you're not supposed to copy. It says let you make archival copies of
archival snapshot of the program in memory.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
which can be used for rapidly loading the program and avoiding that startup time.
Right. And giving copies to your friends.
Well, you can get. You can get. I didn't realize.
There's a running warfare on the ethics of buying and selling.
Yeah, but I want to, very seriously, this is an important problem, because unless program developers have some protection, economic protection for themselves, they're not going to develop programs. Right. So this is not a trivial issue that has to be considered. And incidentally, one of the considerations that went into the Multics design was to make it possible for entrepreneurs to develop programs and to achieve enough protection from the system so that they would put it on the system and the system could collect royalties for them automatically. That was one of the goals originally. I won't say that was fully implemented, but some of those considerations went in.
Those are considerations. I don't think it wasn't proven out. It hasn't proven to be important, but
But somehow those problems have to be solved.
But I think Ed's absolutely right. I think that the prototype of the multi-user timesharing system has still been a very valuable thing to have, because in fact anyone that's been in the business a while realizes that has this tremendous sense of deja vu as we watch the personal computers going through the same agonies of discovering all the things they need to have. For example, one of the things that most of the first personal computers didn't have was a clock. I mean, just an ordinary timestamp. And one of the first things you discover when you're working with a file system, especially as it gets large, is that as within a very brief period of time, you develop the need to have multiple copies of successive generations of a file. And one of the first things you want to do is try to timestamp those so that you can remember when you did something. And furthermore, so that you can develop some kind of mechanical tactics for dumping information. And now that you can put up to 5 and 10 megabytes of memory on a personal computer, it's gotten to be a problem where trying to capture that to do the backup and protective copying, it's getting to be laborious to do it in a brute force way. So you even already have incremental dumping, that is, only the newly created files are to be dumped. And of course, you want that timestamp again. So the ideas are coming back in, but the model of timesharing systems is really.
I find it very frustrating, but I understand that whenever I start a computer, except in Visical, because that's a completely separate operation, it forces me to give the date and the time.
Well, that's a primitive one you have.
Yeah, it's a very primitive thing. Well, it was
but then
one
some
of
the
first
newer ones, like the little Radio
ones.
Shack
They should have.
this
They should have
portable
a
one,
clock.
has
The
the
newer
date
ones
and time
do.
in it. The new ones do.
Yeah,
Complain to your vendor, Bob.
It's simply that I got, fortunately in a sense, one of the first model of the IBM personal computer.
Right, but you can, for just a few bucks more, and that's
buy
all,
like
you can buy an online clock.
Okay,
see?
I'll have to do
So,
it.
they're just going after your pocketbook.
Yeah, I haven't had time to worry about what to add.
One of the just sort of big general comments is, to me, the most interesting thing is that time sharing did happen. There were no technical obstacles to it, but the sort of evolution of it all was quite different than I expected. I think that we expected. We had, when Project BAC was started, we really had dreams of information utilities, even though they might not be called that really would become enormous and global and so on. And instead, what's happened is development happens, but it's fractionated and goes off in 29 different directions, and much slower than it could.
Yeah.
And that just seems to be the way things happen. I sometimes wonder if it would have been better if there might have been some kind of direction from the top and pushed in at least one way. Probably not, because you go off in the wrong way, maybe.
There are some fundamental problems that we haven't solved yet, and I think this is what it is. Multi's trying to solve some of them, but they didn't go far enough. And the two problems are, one, that while we were successful in making access to a computer independent of physical location, which was one of the objectives, in the sense that you could use your computer from any place. We were never able to make it, and still is not possible, intellectually independent of physical location. In the sense that if you happen to have an office in a building with a lot of computer people, you could go next door and say, hey, I've got this trouble. What's going on? That is, you could learn from the environment. But if you happen to be in a building in which you were the only computer user, was very, very discouraging, and it still is. And I know a lot of people that started out with a terminal in their office, very enthusiastic, and essentially gave up out of frustration, because usually the manual are not very good. It's very hard to diagnose problems that you have. You're always in a learning mode, because if you really use a computer, you want to keep using new facilities. And new facilities involve new problems. And if you don't have a help, Now, at some point in the Multics effort, we try to develop some online aids, much more sophisticated than the question mark and the help, which is, they're not very helpful to us. But for various reasons, we never got the thing going. So that's something that still needs a lot of work, or making computer intellectually accessible to a lot of people. The other problem is that while part of there were two actual other things. One is that the intent in the Multics development to arrange things so you could charge a user only for the resources that it used, and in an efficient way so that you could be essentially competitive with a small system that did just what that particular user wanted. It never really got to that point. It didn't work that well.
A little heavy-handed.
Yeah, it didn't really. But, and the third is that really the easiest solution to the problem of protection of your own affairs is to be able to cut the line when you want to the outside world, so that the personal computer provides a very effective solution and inexpensive to the privacy problem, and furthermore gives the feeling to people of controlling your own thing, which has been something that has always bothered people in time-sharing system, namely the feeling there is this monster over there is this administration that controls my life. I don't have a measure of control over my own affairs, which has really affected a great deal of people.
There's still subtle problems with Trojan horse situations. But
there is still that, but it's probably easy to control that.
Sure.
So,
but it seems
those are the trends.
Yeah, there's one thing that the personal computers have allowed to have emphasized, and that is that, and this is something that the ordinary time-sharing system never delivered, and that is namely a very dynamic full-screen representation or communication window into the system, and that has dramatically increased the excitement of using computers, because not only does it allow more elaborate game playing, but at one extreme, but it also allowed the innovation of VisiCalc, for example, which has been had tremendous impact and has been, to some extent, been a major contributor to the popular success of personal computers, because it gave a fundamental justification for everyone having a personal computer, which allowed them to spend the money and rationalize its expense. And it's a very dramatic. But you know, Dan Bricklin and Bob Frankston are the first who developed that program. Are the first to point out that it's that wide bandwidth to the full screen that is so important to the success of that program. You make a change in one part of the scratch pad, and the effect of it can propagate instantaneously to the whole scratch pad, and that's a very important and powerful.
But there is a heck of a lot more in that program, which is very, very important, and it is a really different notion of programming, because in all sense you are programming.
You're programming by declaration.
By declaration, and this is very, very important.
We could spend another day, in fact we did once, on the impact of VisiCalc and the personal computer. I'd love to spend some time, because there's things there. I got a couple of questions sort of to perhaps wrap it up, because it is getting late, and one is that John's been strangely silent about personal computers. Maybe it was the tuna fish sandwich last night.
I'm sorry, I mean,
John hasn't said a word about personal computers, and I wondered if you had any comments, or tuna fish really get to you, and you have nothing to say about PCs.
That's not computers.
It's not computers. And then I did wonder why you haven't mentioned which machines you bought. We're not selling this to any sponsors, and it might be good for the historical record, because I'm sure that in 100 years, Apple, IBM, and Radio Shack won't even exist. And there'll be other strange Chinese or Japanese names.
No, I suspect IBM exists. Apple,
But maybe not in Roman characters. You might want to mention that, and then find something you might want to say.
It's not relevant. No, it's like,
I'm curious why you bought what you bought.
well, you have to say exactly what day you bought it.
Sure, that's
Because
fine.
the
That's
I think
reason,
you've only got one personal computer each.
That's part
I
of
mean,
the why.
you know,
I don't know.
and how many of them do you want to hear about?
I can tell you why I bought an IBM personal computer. The reason is very simple. One day, my daughter, who had worked for 3 years at IBM and was studying at the Sloan School, getting a master, came to me and said, "I can get an IBM personal computer for a 30% discount, and I need something like that to write my master's thesis. And if you give me the money, I'll buy it, and after I finish my master's thesis, which is the legal limit of 6 months anyway, I'll give it back to you." And I said, "Fine."
That's how you got an idea.
Yeah, I got an Apple III just after it was beginning to be shipped, and this is before the IBM computer had been even announced. And the key reasons it was the first one that had the 80 column screen and a 24 and a full typewriter keyboard. The Apple II is terribly crippled and aborted. And it also had the property it could emulate the Apple II. It said, which turned out to be only partially true, and it also had a fairly reasonable operating system, which was influenced strongly by Unix, which in turn came from Multics. So it felt very good as an operating system.
Felt like a grandchild.
What I didn't foresee was that Apple had basically gotten very secretive about how it was put together in contrast to the Apple II, and as a result, they intimidated off all the vendors and all the independent entrepreneurial vendors that would develop software for that system, and sufficiently long that by the time IBM announced their equipment, all the vendors decided that the IBM equipment was a better test bed to build software on. So that has become a modest orphan in the Apple line, primarily because of software. The system works fine, it just doesn't have a lot of independent software on it.
John, do you have a PC of some kind?
Nope. I still wait for them to get better.
Well, they keep changing. I mean, it's frustrating.
I mean, this
because-
thing you're getting for this HP thing you're getting, which has 4 megabytes, is about
That's about right.
what I said was to
Million
be
words.
my threshold.
That's what you wanted back in about 1959, I think it was, or 50.
You're still holding out for a million words, John.
Well, unless do you have any of you want to make any final comments? Otherwise,
Advice to
say
who?
thank you. It's been a very, very helpful, interesting session, and I appreciate the time that you've given on a weekend. Your spouses haven't seen you for a long weekend now. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, and also had the good point of bringing John back to Cambridge for a few days. And getting
Get him back without-
Ed away from Channel 7.
No, I haven't been there for a while.
Chance to relive all our history, John.
What are you doing with Channel 7? Nothing.